To see you.
Yes. So, Satya, you have the floor.
Thank you. Greetings, colleagues. Thank you. Sorry, there's an echo. May I request others to kindly mute their microphones, please? Thank you. Good morning, colleagues from New York. Delighted to have you all signing in today for today's Nexus Dialogue on human rights and the environment. And the theme we are focusing on today is the right to a healthy environment. And you have some amazing speakers and thought leaders in the panel today that you'll be hearing. So let me not spend too much time on the substance and focus rather a bit on the challenge that we are confronting, so that you can all look for the answers throughout the discussions and have a vigorous discussion as we go along. As you know, 2020 has been called the super year for nature and biodiversity. Now, some might argue not so much because of the fact that most of the milestone events that were planned, whether it was the IUCN Congress or whether it was the Convention on Biodiversity Conference of Parties and the UNFCCC Conference of Parties, everything has moved to next year. But that being so, a fact remains that nature and biodiversity are at the greatest threat in our entire history. And that is why it is extremely important that we stay focused on the cause and the substance rather than the processes that drive our response to those challenges. So while those will certainly happen in 2021 in light of COVID-19 and the possibility of a vaccine appearing on the horizon, but at the same time, the challenge remains and the degradation of the Earth's environment continues in a manner that we have never seen before. The Secretary General's call to action on human rights earlier this year, it featured the rights of future generations, especially climate justice, what many of you would know as intergenerational rights. And he framed it as one out of the 7 priority areas for the UN and indeed for the climate champions worldwide. It explicitly called for the UN system to support the efforts of member states related to the human right to a healthy environment. Now, environmental degradation, including climate change and biodiversity loss, is a threat to effective enjoyment of all human rights. We already know that. We also know that this affects those most vulnerable through institutional, political, social, and cultural systems. And that is why we need a human rights-based approach, because it leads to sustainable environmental action. And this has been supported by findings of numerous studies from the IPCC, IPBES, and the Human Rights Council, and many others. The Human and the Environment Nexus Dialogue series, which is the first of the one that we are having today, and then we'll have 2 more, it mobilizes the UN system behind rights-based environmental action, especially in support of the UNSG's call to action on human rights. We must consider protection gaps and opportunities to strengthen the protection of human rights and those who defend them in the context of environmental degradation, which includes climate change and biodiversity loss, and opportunities to develop more effective and sustainable action on the environment through a rights-based approach. Now, let me cite a quick example here. Many a times, we don't make the connection between environmental degradation and human rights, because we are looking for visible signs of them, and many a times they're lost in translation. Let me give you an example from the country I belong to, that is India. And it has the dubious distinction, very unfortunately, of having a predominant large majority of the worst 25 cities in terms of air pollution in the world. And North India, every year for the last several years, since the crop patterns changed in North India, and the gap between the rice and the wheat crops became so small that farmers had no option but to end up burning the crop biomass that is residual after harvesting their rice paddy crop. And that adds anywhere between, in a good year, maybe 200 PM 2.5, PM 2.5 levels to, in a bad year, to up till 800. And if you look at those that are vulnerable, those that have comorbidities, those that have pre-existing conditions, children, women that are confined to homes, in addition to domestic air pollution, this air pollution kills people by the hundreds of the thousands and leaves tens of millions lung impaired for the rest of their lives. Now, if this is not a violation of their human rights, I don't know what is. And that is why all stakeholders really need to look at the telltale signs of what is happening, whether they're short-term, medium-term, or long-term, but the fact that they affect human life at its very root, at its very foundational basis. And it needs to be remedied. And that is exactly why today's Nexus Dialogue on human right to a healthy environment is so very crucial. The language in the Paris Agreement and attention by the HRC to climate change in the environment has indeed increased demand by member states to address it as a human right that must be recognized and respected and remedied, especially in terms of the challenges that it puts across. We are also hoping that this series will facilitate the establishment scope of an EMG issue management group on human rights and the environment, and feed insights into the intergovernmental processes such as the CBD COP15, UNFCCC COP25, UNEA 5 next February, and of course, the HLPF in 2021, and the processes that lead up to them. Welcome to today's Nexus Dialogue, and thank you to the esteemed panelists and of course, all the colleagues that have signed on from different parts of the world. Wish you very energetic and productive discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, ASG Tripathi, and it's a pleasure to have heard those welcoming remarks, which highlighted so well the important subject matter of this discussion. My name is Ben Schachter. I lead the work of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on environment and climate change, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here to the UN EMG Nexus Dialogue on behalf of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And it's great to be here virtually. Thank you for joining us, in particular our panelists, and thank you to UNEP, OHCHR, and EMG colleagues who played a crucial role in bringing this discussion together. As Satya mentioned, this is the first of a three-part discussion on human rights and environment. And I'll just say a few words before we move on to the panel. We hoped to have this discussion in person during the 44th session of the Human Rights Council, but COVID-19 forced change plans. And this, of course, is a story that is playing out across the world. And a critical part of the context in which our discussion now takes place. It starkly illustrates the risk of human society's steadily deteriorating relationship with nature, as well as our failure to cooperate, take evidence-based action, reduce inequalities, and above all else, protect human rights, including the right to a healthy environment. And that's one of the reasons our discussion today is so important. Many of the events, as Satya mentioned, planned as part of this super year for nature in 2020 have been postponed, but the environmental crises that necessitate global collaboration to protect the environment continue full throttle. Notably, the 44th session of the Human Rights Council did proceed under a hybrid virtual format, as did important council discussions on climate change and its impacts on the rights of persons with disabilities and realizing children's rights through a healthy environment. Both matters which I hope our discussion and esteemed panelists will touch upon further. But there's still a risk of losing critical momentum and race against the clock to preserve the environment for current and future generations. Today's discussion, we'll talk about how we address this, and our panelists have been asked to consider questions about what we do next to reduce the risk of future crises by advancing recognition and effective implementation of the human right to a healthy environment. These questions for discussion include, how can UN agencies and the UN EMG better support efforts to advance and fulfill the human rights to a healthy environment in line with the Secretary General's call to action on human rights? How can we ensure the inclusion and protection of groups in vulnerable situations, including children, indigenous peoples, and persons with disabilities in environmental action? Moving forward, what should be the focus of collaboration to effectively protect environmental human rights defenders? This next dialogue is designed to be an interactive, Socratic discussion of these and other issues related to the human right to a healthy environment. After we hear from our panel of experts, your participation of our audience will be welcomed. You are invited to raise your hand when you have a relevant comment or question, at which point we will call upon you to turn on your audio and speak with us. Additionally, we invite you to submit resources, questions, comments, and answers in writing using the Zoom question and answer function. Here you can upvote and comment on each other's contributions, which will let the panelists and myself understand what the most pressing concerns of this group are. We invite you to feel free to start sharing now using the Q&A function. The recorded playback outcome document and any background documents will be available on the Environmental Management Group's website. So with that said, those initial remarks, it's my pleasure to turn things over to our panel of experts. Today's panelists are Mr. David Boyd, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment; Her Excellency Ms. Sabina Stadler Repnik, the Permanent Representative of Slovenia to the United Nations Office in Geneva; Ms. Amy Wickham, Program Specialist, Climate, Energy and Environment; and Ms. Soo-Young Hwang, Legal Officer from UNEP. We'll begin with some remarks from David Boyd. You have 10 minutes.
Great, thanks very much, Ben. And it's a delight to be here with all of you today at the, I wish we were meeting in person, but that's obviously not possible under the circumstances. All right, so I always like to start off talking about the right to a healthy environment in the context of the big picture. And the big picture is this beautiful blue-green planet upon which we are also fortunate to call home is the only planet in the universe where we know that life exists. And yet, as all of us know, humans are not really doing a great job of taking care of this beautiful planet. We are living in the midst of a climate emergency where carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere because of human activities are at their highest level in millions of years. We're in the midst of a nature meltdown where over 1 million species are at risk of extinction. We know that, as Satya mentioned in his opening comments, pollution kills 9 million people a year, including hundreds of thousands of children under the age of 5. And this year, of course, we've been devastated by the COVID-19 pandemic, a pandemic which is the result of, as Ben mentioned, our dysfunctional relationship with the natural world. And these interlocking global environmental crises, really, it's absolutely essential that we recognize that they don't have the same effect on everyone, that they disproportionately affect the poorest, most vulnerable, and most marginalized people in the world. And so it's really, I think, absolutely imperative that we listen to what the scientists are telling us, whether it's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. The world scientists are speaking with one voice, that we need transformative changes and we need to make those changes on an urgent basis. And that's where the power of human rights, I think, is so exciting. Because if we look back over the last several centuries of human history, we see that human rights have been a catalyst for exactly the kind of societal transformations that we need today. Whether we talk about the abolitionists using human rights to bring about the end of slavery, the suffragettes who used rights to bring about equality for women, the indigenous peoples movements, the civil rights movements, the LGBTQ+ movements, all of these movements used human rights as framing for the changes that they wanted to bring about in society. And that's not to say it's easy or instant or that human rights are omnipotent. Of course, it's hard, it's challenging, and the implementation is a long road. But history proves that these rights have power. And that's why it's so exciting to talk about the right to a healthy environment in light of today's global environmental crisis. This map shows us that over 80% of UN member states already recognize in their constitutions, their national environmental laws, or through the ratification of regional treaties, 80% of UN member states recognize the right to a healthy environment. So this map really tells us two things. Number one, we have to color this entire map green. There's still about 40 states that don't recognize the right to a healthy environment. And the majority of those states, surprisingly, are small island states. And the second thing this map tells us is that we have a lot of work to do in terms of implementation. We know from decades of experience what the right to a healthy environment means. It has procedural elements, it has substantive elements. On the procedural side, it includes access to information, public participation in decision-making, and access to justice with effective remedies. On the substantive side, it includes clean air, a safe climate, healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, safe water and sanitation, non-toxic environments in which people can live, work, study, and play, and healthy and sustainably produced food. And the thing that I want to really bring to bear on this conversation is that these are not just aspirations, these are obligations, and we have the solutions at hand. In my latest report to the Human Rights Council, my team and I compiled over 500 good practices from more than 170 states in the implementation of people's right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And I just want to run through a few examples of those good practices because I think it really can empower us to know that these solutions are at hand and they really just need to be scaled up and sped up. So in terms of access to information, there's a group of 12 South Pacific states that are working together to create an information portal, which will be a terrific source of information on their environmental challenges and their environmental actions for their people. Getting children and youth involved in environmental decision-making is essential, and countries like Finland and Norway have institutionalized roles for children in environmental decision-making processes. Costa Rica is a world leader in terms of access to justice. They have an ombudsperson, they have a specialized environmental tribunal, and they have a constitutional court that has made dozens of precedent-setting decisions in cases involving the right to a healthy environment. And when we turn to the substantive side, Satya mentioned air pollution in India. Well, in India and Indonesia, government programs to subsidize clean cook stoves and clean fuels are benefiting hundreds of millions of people in India, in Indonesia, in Ecuador, and other countries. That's a life-changing improvement. We have a coalition globally led by Canada and the UK that's pushing for the end of coal-fired electricity, and more than 30 countries now have joined that coalition, which is terrific because not only is coal an immense source of greenhouse gas emissions, but also air pollution. And so when we talk about the right to a safe climate, this is critical. And we're seeing huge shift in that transformation from fossil fuel-based economies to clean energy. Wind is up 300% since 2000. The amount of solar electricity that's generated is up 600 times since the year 2000 on a global basis. And again, this is being driven by economics, the falling costs. In terms of healthy and sustainably produced food, supporting agroecology and agroforestry are two of the most important things we can do. And we have countries like France showing leadership in protecting the right to a healthy environment by banning the use of all of the bee-killing neonicotinoid pesticides. In terms of access to water and sanitation, tremendous progress in countries all over the world. In Paraguay, they recognized the right to water in 2007. They transferred responsibility to the Ministry of Health. And in that short span of 13 years, the percentage of people in Paraguay living in the rural areas with access to safe drinking water and sanitation has gone from 50% to 99%. Plastic pollution. This is not just an oceans problem. Plastic is now being found in the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the food we eat. But more than 50 countries have already brought in laws to start banning the use of unnecessary single-use plastics. And when we turn to healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, we know that one of the single most important things we can do is to recognize the rights to land and tenure of indigenous peoples and local communities, because we have scientific evidence that their stewardship of land results in higher levels of biodiversity, more healthy forests, lower levels of poverty, and a range of other huge benefits. And I like to talk about the fact that when we take an integrated rights-based approach to these problems, we can solve multiple problems at the same time. And my favorite example of this is Africa's Great Green Wall Initiative, involving 21 countries in the Sahel, stretching from Senegal in the west to Djibouti in the east. And these countries are doing amazing things. For example, the Niger has already restored 5 million hectares of land that was degraded and is now producing food, is now growing trees, improving food security, improving access to water, reducing poverty. And so this kind of initiative can address multiple human rights concerns. And of course, what's really fascinating is that the children of the world are saying the same thing as our leading scientists, that we have to take action to transform society. This was a group of children that I met with in Fiji on a country mission, thanks to UNICEF. And time is short, so I'm going to wrap up by saying that the great news is that all of the UN family is on the same page here, whether it's the Secretary General, Michelle Bachelet, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Inger Anderson, Henrietta Fore from UNICEF. All of these high-ranking individuals have called for the urgent recognition of people's fundamental right to live in a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. I believe this could be one of the most powerful human rights of the 21st century. And this slide illustrates this. This is a picture taken from a NASA space shuttle 1.4 billion kilometers away from Earth, which you can see Earth in the lower right-hand corner. If we have the ingenuity to take this kind of a photograph, surely we have the ability to solve our pressing environmental challenges. Thanks to the organizers for today's event. Thanks to all of you who are participating. I know that you're all doing hard work on behalf of the people and the planet we love, and I look forward to the Q&A session. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David. Perfect on time and eloquent as always in clearly defining and describing what the human right to a healthy environment is and the difference that it can make and its recognition can make in people's lives. I also just want to add a little bit to what you said in terms of the UN and the call for global recognition of the human right to a healthy environment. This is a priority for the High Commissioner for Human Rights, for the UNEP Executive Director, for the UNICEF Executive Director, and most importantly, it's a priority for the Secretary General as articulated in the call to action for human rights. And that's why we're so glad to have UNICEF, UNEP, and OHCHR working together here in this panel and elsewhere. Our next panelist is Ambassador Sabina Zlarini from the Permanent Mission of Slovenia. Ambassador Repnik and Slovenia have really led the political discussions at the Human Rights Council related to human rights and environment for many years as part of the core group sponsoring a resolution on human rights and environment that establishes the mandate of the Special Rapporteur. And we very much enjoy the collaboration we've had over the past years and look forward to hearing from you. Over to you, Ambassador Repnik.
Thank you so much, Ben. It's a pleasure to be again in the panel together with you and also with David, but it's a little bit intimidating because David is always so excited about it and all these nice PPTs behind his voice. I'll try to do my best. So let me first thank the Environmental Management Group for inviting me to participate in this webinar. It's a big honor for me and our mission to participate again after a little bit less than 2 years. And I'm thrilled to be with you here to have this opportunity to update you what we have been up to during this period. So as some of you may know, an informal process on a possible recognition to the right to a healthy environment has started. And I'd like to use this intervention of mine to speak a little bit about the process, the current state of play, but let me start with just a bit of a background. So when we talk about the human rights and the environment, the debates started already in the times of the Commission. But then back in 2011, the Human Rights Council adopted a resolution, the resolution 16/11, which mandated the OHCHR to prepare an analytical study, the first study on the relationship between human rights and the environment. And this was then a good basis to move on with the concrete actions, like establishment of the mandate of the independent expert on human rights and the environment a year later. That was 2012. And that mandate later changed into the special rapporteur. In the last few years, both the mandates, but also the council itself, the work and the resolutions focused on numerous issues, from air pollution to children's rights, from biodiversity to climate change, but also good practices, as already mentioned by David. There are in parallel many other activities happening, interactive dialogues, series of events, conferences, extensive research, but most importantly, we do note and we do actually witness progressive development of law and policies, and this is what is really encouraging. So what I wanted to speak about is this particular right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And this is one of the topics that keeps me and my mission really busy this year in 2020. And I think it's really a topical and actual theme, also in the light of what is actually happening in front of our eyes, the whole catastrophe of the COVID virus and what actually can happen when the nature reacts in a very forceful way. It looks like a revenge. So with this background, this is not just this decade of action, but actually it happened quite some time ago. So this debate in the field of human rights and environmental law, it goes on, it's been going on actually for decades. It's maybe not explicitly about the recognition of this right, but it's been like decades now of paving the path where we are actually today. And where it actually began, the first formal acknowledgement of the human right to live in a healthy environment appeared first in the Stockholm Declaration back in 1972. It's the soft law status, but it had a profound impact on environmental law, but also constitutional law and the human rights law. I'm talking here about the principle 1 of that declaration that reads like, man has the fundamental right to freedom, equality, and adequate conditions of life in an environment of equality that permits a life of dignity and well-being, and he bears a solemn responsibility to protect and improve the environment for present and future generations. And this, like almost 50 years ago, I think it sets really good basis and actually puts in front of us kind of a vision. And as has been already said today, 156 states have some kind of a binding legal obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill the right to a healthy environment. But we have to acknowledge that there is no uniform approach and that this right has different forms. Some states do recognize this right on a constitutional level. Some of them deal with the issue on the legislative level. Some of the states use the international framework to frame what they do in this particular area. But it seems that this is not enough. Why? Because there have been growing calls by the civil society, especially youth, but also certain states that we would need a recognition, global recognition of this particular right. And in the last months, and I'm very, very happy about that, we have also noted growing support from different representatives of the United Nations, as already mentioned, the UN Secretary General in his call to action, Executive Director of UNEP. And since I come from Geneva, I'm very, very happy that the High Commissioner for Human Rights also in her statement in the last Human Rights Council really outlined some very, very important key messages as far as the right to a healthy environment is concerned. She mentioned, among others, that we need measures to ensure a safe and stable climate, a toxic-free environment, clean air, clean water, safe and nutritious food. And she called for education with respect for nature. We need a right to kind of frame well the participation, the right to participation, the right to information, and also the right to access to justice. So now it's really time that, since it's a priority for all these high-level representatives of the United Nations, it's also prime time that we make it also a priority for all the states, all the member states. So what we are doing now, Slovenia is working together with the other members of the core group, which are Costa Rica, Maldives, Morocco, and Switzerland. We are working hard on the process of informal consultations. This is an informal intergovernmental process that is supposed to pave a solid way to the possible proclamation of this right. And we started with individual and small group discussions, namely because of the pandemic and the kind of impositions imposed on us, or restrictions imposed on us because of this pandemic. And now we intend to follow up and follow on by regional consultations. So what is our idea? Our idea is to recognize the right on a global level through a process, a gradual process, that we first adopt a resolution by the Human Rights Council. We are talking about the human rights, so we believe it's the right thing to do to go first to the Human Rights Council, and then to continue the process in the General Assembly. So a lot of hard work has been already invested in this effort. We are really trying to provide and make space for discussion, for exchange of ideas, exchange of views, a lot of space for mutual understanding. Why we are doing all this? Because we deem very important that the recognition would be consensual. Because this is the only way how to ensure that the right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment would then be also fully and duly implemented. The only way how to do that is that we have the whole international community united and standing behind it. Of course, in parallel, we are working on different events, conferences. We are holding many discussions with the civil society, with the academia, with different mechanisms. There are still quite many questions. And I really hope and I really believe that this inclusive process that we've started will bring positive results. So not to use too much time, I think I will stop at this point, and maybe I will add something then further more in discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for all of your efforts and your sharing with us the process that Slovenia and the rest of the core group, Morocco, Maldives, Switzerland, and Costa Rica, are undertaking in the Council to push for recognition. We wish you the best of luck in that, and of course are always happy to support in any way we can. It's really, really critical and really important work. I'd just like to remind our audience to go ahead and raise your hand and type Q&A in the question and answer Zoom function. We will be hearing from 2 more panelists, and then hopefully from you and our panelists again. So please feel free. We've got colleagues monitoring both the chat, the Q&A, and the hand raising, so that we will do our best to respond to all of you and hear from you. Our next panelist is Amy Wickham, who is a program specialist on climate, energy, and environment with UNICEF. Amy, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Nina, who I believe is now sharing some slides on my behalf. Great. Her Excellency, Ms. Sabina, Special Rapporteur David Boyd, expert moderators, esteemed panelists, and ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to thank the Environmental Management Group for the opportunity to participate in this important dialogue today. As many of you are aware, globally more than 1.7 million children under the age of 5 lose their lives every year as a result of avoidable environmental impacts, while millions more suffer disease, disability, and an array of other forms of harm, some of which can result in lifelong effects. We in UNICEF firmly believe that the climate and environmental crisis is a child's rights crisis, and as the Secretary General has said, it is also the defining issue of our time. Children's access to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is essential for children's physical, mental, and social development from infancy into adulthood, and it's necessary for the realization of their rights. So for these reasons, UNICEF fully supports the global recognition of the human right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Such a step would be of particular relevance for children and future generations who shoulder a disproportionate share of burden of environmental harm. In this discussion today, I would like in particular to highlight how we must ensure the inclusion and protection of these groups in vulnerable situations, and in particular children and young people in environmental action. Next slide. Youth participation at national level in global forums to discuss and agree on necessary climate action is already happening, and it is expected to increase in coming years as youth continue gaining spaces and opportunities to influence the political agenda in each country and globally. These spaces provide great momentum for adolescents and youth to showcase their climate actions, to participate in decision-making, and to call for increased commitment and urgent action from states. And as many of you know, children have a right to safely share their views on issues concerning them and to be heard. And they also have a right to peaceful assembly. In UNICEF, we support children and young people in exercising these rights. Next slide. Some examples are by providing them with the skills and information needed to engage in climate action and to be able to participate meaningfully in national and international negotiations and platforms, by elevating the voices of children and young people in the global climate discourse, by encouraging their environmental activism and promoting their involvement in activities that combine environmental sustainability and economic development, and by including children and young people in climate negotiations and platforms such as COP, providing platforms for them to press for the reduction of pollution and pushing governments and businesses to create more opportunities in the green economy. In addition to that, UNICEF is also a core partner of the Children's Environmental Rights Initiative, alongside UNEP and others, and under the auspices of our UN Special Rapporteur, David Boyd, which is a global coalition pushing to secure the global recognition of children's right to a safe and healthy environment, including a new global charter on child rights and the environment. UNICEF is also a joint custodian of the Intergovernmental Declaration on Children, Youth and Climate Action, launched at COP25, signed by 12 governments so far, including Slovenia, and the declaration sets out a framework for a child rights-based approach to climate action with particular focus on the UNFCCC and Paris implementation. And last but not least, UNICEF is advancing children's substantive rights by incorporating climate resilience into our programs, such as climate smart health, education, and water and sanitation systems. Many fear that the COVID-19 crisis has a setback for progress on climate change. However, the way we respond to the crisis is an opportunity to pool expertise and knowledge together and invest in solutions that not only can improve our response and recovery to the COVID crisis, but also help to reimagine a greener, more sustainable future. In this spirit, UNICEF continues to build resilience and disaster preparedness directly into post-COVID recovery and stimulus plans, and to fully integrate climate and environmental imperatives in these plans, and urges member states to do so too. The pandemic cannot be used as an excuse to slow down our collective efforts to combat climate change. Rather, it should be an opportunity to accelerate our efforts. Climate-smart health, education, and water and sanitation systems are more resilient not just to climate change, but to all sorts of crises, including pandemics and subsequent economic crisis. Next slide. In closing, I would just like to re-emphasize the importance that we hear children's voices and we ensure a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment for this generation and for generations to come. Not only is this a precondition for the realization of children's rights as required by the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but simply put, it's a necessity for dignified life on Earth for all. UNICEF stands ready to support you all as you do so too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amy. And I think the work on children's rights and environment UNICEF is doing is so critical. So it's great to have that update from you. And also just want to highlight, that there will be a resolution tabled at the upcoming session of the Human Rights Council, which will be the resolution for the day of discussion on children's rights that is authored each year by GRULAC and the EU. And it will primarily focus on the issue of children's rights and the environment as an outcome of the day of discussion on that subject that took place during the 44th session of the Human Rights Council earlier, a few weeks ago, earlier this month. So we're also looking forward to that space for further discussion of issues related to children's rights and the environment. Our next speaker is joining us from many time zones away, and we're very grateful to her for doing so. Soo-Young Hwang is a legal officer with the Division of Environmental Law of UNEP and a former colleague of mine. So very good to be working with you in this context. And we look forward to hearing your remarks. Thank you, Soo-Young.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, panelists and everyone. I'm very, very happy to be here. And Ambassador spoke about intimidation, but you cannot even imagine that I'm actually here and speaking after all the other speakers. Just give me 1 second. I'm pulling the PowerPoint presentation. Can everybody see this? Okay, so just a quick introduction. So my name is Soo-Young Hwang. As Ben mentioned, I'm a legal officer with UNEP right now, and I used to work with the OHCHR and especially with David Boyd. So I've been working with also Slovenia and the core group in the past, and I'm very, very happy to be here, and then also joined by Amy from UNICEF. So I'm given 1 minute, so I'll be I'm given 5 minutes, and then Ben has my permission to switch off my microphone. That's what we do at the Human Rights Council, so we're going to be very consistent with the rules, so I'll be very, very quick. So as a lot of actually panelists and also the ASG Tripathi mentioned in the very beginning. So UNEP's priority and the whole UN is actually coming together to support the right to healthy environment and the implementation of the right to healthy environment, and also the promotion of the global recognition, which is really being pushed by Slovenia. So as you can see, UNEP is one of the top priority for environmental rights is a promotion of the right to healthy environment and implementation, and also the environmental defenders. Those are 3 priority areas for us. As you can see, Ingrid Anderson has spoken very vocally about the global recognition, and also we had an MOU signed between OHCHR and UNEP last year, as you can see in the picture with Michelle Bachelet and the Ingrid Anderson from UNEP. And also we had the pleasure of also having the executive director of UNICEF joining the call last year at the Human Rights Council, supporting the recognition of the right to healthy environment. And also the SG came to the council early this year, and then having his launching his call to action for human rights. And one of it actually is about the right to healthy environment under the focus area of rights of future generations and climate climate justice. So, and then as in supporting the SG's call to action, so UN, I thought, the ambassador and David and Amy talk quite a lot about the substance and all this, all the rationales and the processes of right healthy environment. So I thought I'd actually talk about like how we're going to implement it and what the UN can do. So we, as following the SG's call to action, UN has been having discussions about like how we're going to implement and how we're going to assist states to implement the right healthy environment, and as well as to bring it up to, so that we bring it up to the council and the GA later to have this right recognized at the global level. So one of the things that we have been discussing is just the UPR reviews, and I'm not going to read through all this. I'm just putting it out there so that you can have a look. I'll just and share it with the organizers so that we can you can put this you can have it in the background document. So the UPR session, the Universal Peer Review, is the intergovernmental process peer review of all human rights issues and every 4 to 5 years, and this is a really good tool to actually like track human rights recommendations and how like states are making progress, and those are actually done by states, not only by experts. So and it's being tracked for every 4 years. So the reason of actually, so we did a research on you know, how much of the right to healthy environment is integrated in the UPR process. So without without actually going to all these cycles, we only did the cycle 3 for now. So analyzing sessions from 27 to 35, which is about like 3.5 years of work. So you can, as you can see, actually the right to healthy environment has been actually like recommended by many states to like other like peer states, and they use actually the term like right to healthy environment. They ask you know, strengthen the right to healthy environment and make sure that it's implemented in a non-discriminatory manner. So you can actually see how salient the right to healthy environment at the council is. And then this is really a tool that the UN could help assisting states to implement these rights. And also one of another just last slide that I wanted to show you is so, and this is previous slide was only about the right to healthy environment, as you can see, but this is also this is analysis of the recommendations relating to the environment. So you will see that environmental issues, all environmental issues, environmental policy, environmental degradation or biodiversity, and all the like procedural rights and also substantive rights that, as David mentioned in the beginning. And surprising, there were like over 600, almost like 700 recommendations. That's the number of recommendations that was made within the time frame of 3.5 years on the environment. So, and this also like really tells us about like what kind of trends that we're heading to. So like not just the number of the resolutions, but there are a lot of resolutions relating to the general environmental issues and also the implementation of it, also business and climate change and disasters and vulnerable populations, such as including future generations, children's rights and the women, gender, and the rights of the persons with disabilities or indigenous peoples. So this is, I just quickly wanted to present this to show like this is one of the ways how the UN can help and together like to implement the right to healthy environment and human rights and the environment on the ground, but also at at the council and also like in promotion of the right to healthy environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Soo-Young, and really useful to hear a bit more about how one of the Human Rights Council's mechanisms can help better address issues related to implementation of the human right to a healthy environment. Very practical and appreciated presentation and remarks. Our panelists have done remarkably well keeping the time. We're probably a little bit over because I've talked too much. So I'll turn things over to our audience and just remind you, please do raise your hand in the Zoom chat, there's a hand, you can click and raise it if you would like to speak, and then we will give you the opportunity to speak directly with us. And please type questions in the Q&A if you have questions. We have a hand raised from Genevieva Sotorova. Nina, would you give Genevieva the floor?
Floor is given.
Hello, you hear me? I'm Genoveva Sotirova. I'm new in this case. I would like just to ask simple question. Can I receive some of presentation, or I need to read more about this point, because in my community, I'm from Bulgaria, I'm from Gypsy ethnic community. I would like to help to my community to improve our health condition, because we are very poor and we need help.
Thank you, Genevieva. Just to flag that this particular discussion will be made available on the UN Environmental Management Group's website. Nina has shared the link and can do so again. There will also be a number of resource materials made available on the website. So we hope that those resource materials and this discussion can be useful for you. And I would now turn to the Q&A and ask, we have several questions, some of which have been asked and answered, and some of which have been directed to specific panelists. So Ambassador Stadler Repnik, we have a question about how civil society can support the work to table or bring a resolution at the council. And I think that more broadly, it would be quite interesting to hear your thoughts about how partners can support these efforts. Over to you, Ambassador.
Yes, thank you, Ben, and thank you for good questions. So indeed, there was a question about the role and possible help of civil society, but also about what kind of questions we are getting during the consultations. So first, let me say that we deeply and highly appreciate the role of the civil society. They're actually playing one of the crucial roles, be it youth, be it kind of other groups of interested public, but also the NGOs. So we, as I explained, we tried to pursue a process that is inclusive. So we really put a lot of emphasis to do the outreach and to reach out also to the civil society. So we include the civil society in regular consultations. We had the last meeting just like a month ago with like 25 different representatives of different civil society groups, let's say. And it's extremely important for us to exchange the views with them, to actually build on the mutual understanding. And we are very happy to see them acting and helping them with their own pressure on the states, their own pressure for more dialogue with their own arguments why this right is so important, at what kind of additional value it brings. So I can only ask the civil society to keep helping us with their actions, with advocacy, with statements, and with pushing the states to do the steps in the right directions. So about the questions that we are getting, the questions during the consultations, there are of course easier and more difficult ones. So there are easier ones about the timelines and why this right is really needed, what is the added value, but We do receive also quite complex questions, majority of them quite, let's say, legal. For example, what is the legal status of this right? How to recognize this right? What are the right, what is the right process? What are the right instruments for the recognition of this right? Is resolution enough? Are we going to follow up with the convention, for example? Then it's a batch of questions linked to the monitoring, how the implementation of this right is going to be monitored, and what is the role of treaty bodies in monitoring of this right. Then there are questions about different formulations of this right, because as I said, 150 states, they all have a little bit different approach. So it's actually the question about all these different adjectives and which adjectives mean what exactly, and what would be actually then this, let's say, global adjective when we go for the recognition. Another question, is this a standalone right, or is this a right deriving from other rights? So these are all the challenges that do not really help to speed up the process, but they rather hold us back. Why? Because we want to do the process prudently. As I said, we are working towards a consensus. We would like to have the whole international community more or less united behind what we do. And this is already my answer to another question which was posed to me, which is about the timelines of the process. So the consultations that we are undertaking now, we plan that they will last for months. The pandemic ruined our plans, so we started to approach the countries individually. We will go for the regional consultations, of course, but even after the regional consultations, I'm sure we will have to go to specific countries again in an individual manner and apply this individual approach to see where the consensus actually really lies. In parallel, we do plan to do side events, so the whole timeline very much depends on the evolution of the process, building up a consensus. And my wish would be that it happens next year, or at least till the 50th anniversary of the Stockholm Declaration that I mentioned before. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, for answering those questions. We have a hand raised from Carlos Olaya. Nina, would you give Carlos the floor?
Floor given.
Hi, did you hear me?
We hear you, Carlos. Please go ahead.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Carlos Olaya. I am from Colombia. And I have a question. I'm worried that in some cases, like Colombia, global environmental goals are being used to advance authoritarian agendas that are harming other kinds of human rights. Of course, we will expect that governments enforce human rights in an integral way without harming other human rights. But there's always this risk. So I'm worried that this initiative, if this initiative has some kind of clause or instrument to avoid these kind of risks. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. And David, if I could perhaps ask you to respond to this question and maybe say a little bit more about the previous question you've responded to in writing as well about the issue of business obligations related to the human right to a healthy environment. Over to you, David.
Well, thanks very much, Ben. And in fact, this is partly a subject of my next report to the General Assembly, which is on healthy ecosystems and healthy biodiversity as a fundamental elements of the right to a healthy environment. And there's no question that over the past past decades, there have been violations of human rights in the name of conservation. We've seen indigenous peoples evicted in Kenya, in other African countries, in Southeast Asian countries to make way for national parks. That is a completely unacceptable path of action. That is a violation of the human rights of those indigenous peoples and local communities and cannot be tolerated. I know there's an independent panel working on a report that will be coming out in September reviewing the actions of the World Wildlife Fund in terms of its role, its complicity in some of these human rights violations, which I think will be a very useful report in terms of recommendations for avoiding those kinds of situations that you're talking about, Carlos. I know that in Colombia, the right to a healthy environment has been protected in the national constitution since the early 1990s and has been of benefit to indigenous peoples and local communities. There are, as you probably know, Carlos, some really powerful decisions from the Supreme Court of Colombia, from the Constitutional Court of Colombia, that protect not only the right to a healthy environment, but the rights to water, the rights to culture, the rights to food, the rights to land of indigenous peoples and local communities in areas such as the Rio Atrato, in the Parque Salamanca. And so we have these powerful examples of where these rights can actually be achieved in harmony. And it doesn't have to be a trade-off between the right to a healthy environment and other human rights. And that really, I think, is the fundamental premise of the Sustainable Development Goals, is that we have to achieve these things concurrently. We have to reduce poverty. We have to ensure everyone has access to clean energy. And so that's really the challenge, is to find integrated solutions that advance multiple pathways and multiple human rights through the same actions. And those are some of the things that I highlighted, of course, in my good practices report. In terms of business and human rights, well, okay, obviously the first thing is businesses have responsibilities to protect human rights. The UN principles on human rights in business are crystal clear on that. But those guidelines are not legally enforceable. And so that's why I think it's vitally important for all states to enact legislation that requires businesses to comply with their human rights obligations. We're seeing growth in this area. France passed a due diligence law a couple of years ago. Other European states are looking at similar types of legislation. And I personally believe that the only way we'll get businesses to comply with their human rights responsibilities is if they are mandated country by country in legislation, so that those businesses can be held legally accountable if they do not comply with those responsibilities. Also just wanted to tack on a couple of thoughts to the Ambassador Stadler Repnik's answers on the previous question. In terms of recognition of this right, I mean, we are in the midst of a global environmental crisis, which all of us acknowledge. And I think that's really the driving force for the urgency of recognizing this right. I mean, it's been around since the 1970s, as we've discussed. It's recognized by over 80% of UN member states. And we really need to get this formal recognition at the United Nations done as quickly as possible. I agree completely with the ambassador that we should strive for consensus in terms of support for the resolution, but we must not let our opponents delay and obfuscate and stop this from happening, because it doesn't have to be by consensus. We've seen that in the past. We saw the critically important UN resolutions on the rights to water and sanitation in 2010 were not passed by consensus. In fact, there were more than 40 countries that abstained or from the resolution at the General Assembly in 2010 on the rights to water and sanitation. That's not a perfect outcome, but the passage of those resolutions in 2010 has been such a catalyst for stronger laws in many countries, changes to constitutions in a number of countries, and most importantly, increased resources and acceleration of efforts to respect, protect, and fulfill the rights to water and sanitation on the ground across the world, delivering safe water and adequate sanitation to people who desperately need it. So yes, in an ideal world, we would have a consensus resolution on the right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, but the planet and the people need that resolution as soon as humanly possible. And if it's not by consensus, then it'll still be by a wide majority. And I agree also that this is just a first step. A United Nations resolution is not a binding legal instrument. There is an ongoing negotiation that's actually underway this week in Nairobi about a new pact for the environment, which would be potentially a legally binding instrument. It may end up being a political declaration. It's impossible to speculate at this point in time. But ultimately, the right to a healthy environment, because of its fundamental importance to human dignity, to human life, to human well-being, should have the same legal authority as every other human right that's in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as every other human rights that's in the International Covenant for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And so a UN resolution is a critical step in that direction, but we will need to continue our work in the years ahead. I mean, this is going to be a lifelong project for some of us, I'm sure, to achieve legal recognition of that right at the global level. We need to continue pushing for strengthening of constitutions and laws at the national level as well. And so, yeah, that's the task. And at the same time, because so many states already recognize this right in constitutions, in legislation, we can already begin, and states are already implementing this right. And all we need to do is just push that to happen faster, wider, and in order to fulfill this basic and essential human right.
Thank you very much, David, for that passionate plea for action now on the human right to a healthy environment. I have a question for Soo-Young in the chat. How can UNEP support processes such as the UPR or use the UPR cycle findings to further the right to a healthy environment? I also have a request for the floor from Hussein Fadeh and from Shane Enright. So what I'd like to suggest is we take those two comments from the audience, at which point I think we will need to start moving towards concluding remarks from our panelists. If we have enough time, we can of course hear from one or two others. And in thinking about those concluding remarks, I'd ask you to respond to the questions we're going to hear now from our audience, and Soo-Young to the question from Angela on the UPR, but also to the guiding questions we posed at the beginning here about what we can do to advance this discussion. You know, what can the UN Environmental Management Group do? How can UN agencies mobilize around this issue? What are the critical actions that need to be taken by us and other stakeholders in the coming months and years to not only achieve global recognition, but also implement the right, which of course is a whole nother challenge to handle. So Hussein, over to you.
I hope that can you hear me? No. Can you hear me, Ben?
Yes, Hussein,
Okay, thank you. Sorry that I am interrupting your course of discussion, but I was triggered by the question by Carlos. And it made me just intervene now here, because I would like to sort of seek views of the distinguished panelists on some of the issues that could help us also in the EMG to contemplate and address these issues hopefully in the future under this new process of human rights and environment in the EMG. I have been within this family of environment human rights for a while, and I am very much also enthusiastic what has been said so far in terms of our collective effort to sort of support both procedural and also substantive processes of human rights and environment. But I also am familiar with the challenges in both sides. Well, what is very interesting for us maybe to focus more in order to ensure encouragement of these sort of social, economic, and political and environmental, the other sectors to be more committed. It's basically identifying obviously nexus areas that help us to develop collaboration around them, but also not shy away to discuss the trade-off, because it is inevitable that we won't have any trade-off topics, at least that we cannot ignore. So we would like to know what are those critical trade-off areas that are being looked as a stumbling block for addressing human rights and environment, and in either in the substantive areas or also in the procedure. It'd be very interesting to have some of those examples for us to perhaps to look at. The other thing is that hearing what David said in terms of encouraging and implementing and having more countries adopt substantive rights is about the conditionalities that we have always heard. Development, capacities, etc., resources of countries, especially countries in the south. What are the possible incremental pathways for us to take? Incremental solutions that we can think of in order to gradually engage more and more of countries, especially in the south, to become more committed to both procedural and also substantive rights, recognition, application, and implementation. I'll stop here, and I wanted, before colleagues and panelists go to this concluding mode, think of nexus areas, trade-off areas, and also incremental pathways. And perhaps this will give us some ideas about the future focus of the EMG. Over to you, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Hussein. So I have 2 requests from the floor. We've got about 10 minutes left for discussion. So I'll ask those who've raised their hands to take no more than a minute to ask a question or make a concrete comment or recommendation, starting with Shane Enright. Over to you, Shane.
Or given.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you. Please
excellent. Sorry about that. So I'm Shane Enright. I'm from BirdLife International, the global partnership of over 100 national partner organizations. We have 10 million supporters. I think we're amongst the largest civil society grassroots movements. And I really just wanted to share with your audience, not necessarily with a panel, because you will know that we are wholly behind this initiative. And in fact, just last week, we launched a new website, One Planet, One Right, which is a website which is intended absolutely to bring our activists and supporters on board at a grassroots level to lobby and work within their own communities and at a national level to bring about the sort of multilateral change that we need. So I just wanted to share that with you.
Thank you very much, Shane, for sharing that. And I have Alexander Shestakov. No more than a minute, please, Alexander.
Floor given.
Alexander.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks to all presenters. I'm Alexander Shestakov from the CBD Secretariat. As you're all aware, we are working on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And the issue of rights for healthy environment, also, of course, first of all, in relation to biodiversity, will be a substantial part of this framework. But I also, this discussion is really interesting, instrumental, and may help in our debates. I also invite all of you to look at the draft Global Biodiversity Strategy from your perspective. We also have a period of peer review and comments currently, including indicators for implementation. And indicators related to human rights will be extremely important to put into the framework. So please provide your input. And the last point is that many of our parties, while of course they're talking about human rights and rights for environment, they actually very strongly bring the issue of rights of nature. And that is another component which we believe need to be discussed together with human rights. And they're actually asking us, especially developing countries, to bring the concept and notion of rights of nature and rights of environment into the framework together with the issue of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander, and thank you to all of our audience. I'd like to turn things over now to our panelists for their concluding remarks and responses to the questions raised. And I'm sorry we don't have more time for a discussion. This will be the first step along what I hope will be a much longer discussion about how we can move forward on these issues. Soo-Young, starting with you, there was a specific question on the UPR, and feel free to respond to anything else that you'd like to in closing.
Okay, thank you, Ben, and thank you, everyone. So I'll actually the answer to the question. I think that also answers the guiding questions about like what the UN can do, and also not only the promotion, also the implementation side of the right to healthy environment. So thank you, Angela, for the questions. I'll answer the first question from her is how can what can UN do to promote the what can UNEP, also the UN can do to support the process, the UPR process? And I think one is actually the promotion of the UPR process. I've been hearing quite a lot about that. So although there are like many recommendations relating to the environment, but it's not like one is not enough in terms of number, but two is also like it's quite concentrated in certain countries. Although like climate change and environmental issues is an issue for all countries, but it's not always discussed by all countries. So I think we should do more of prioritizing environmental issues with the countries. So like bring them to let them know about like how your human rights issue that it actually relates to environmental issue and vice versa. And one good example is like maybe producing guidance. So one good example that I can think of is we have so that with the mandate, so David and UNEP and some other with UNICEF as well, and we have this initiative going on. It's called the Children's Rights Environmental Rights Initiative, and we have produced also like something called the CRC guidance. So it's a guidance on how you can report to the Convention on the Rights of the Children on environmental issues. So it gives like specific guidance to states and the NGOs about like how you can do it. So something like that for UPR would be very helpful to raise a profile of the environmental issues and also the implementation side. So once a recommendation is done, like don't forget it. So like spread it out to your colleagues on the ground, the UNRC's office and your country offices, because they're going to really help and work with the governments on the ground to implement this. So that's one, what the UN and the UNEP can do. And second is using the right, how can the UPR process can help the right to healthy environment. I think we should, UPR, the recommendations in my view is underutilized. There's a lot of recommendation coming out of it, but it's not well known. So I think like making it known. It's not like creating something new, but like to bring it to the to more people, to make people know about like the recommendations on the right to healthy environment, and we should implement it. So I think that's how we can also promote the right to healthy environment. So this is where I will stop, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Soo-Young. And Amy, over to you. There was some questions about renewable energies and rights, and some other questions as well that we're hoping we may address, but feel free to respond to whatever whatever spoke to you. You have 2 to 3 minutes.
Thank you, Ben. And thank you to everybody for this very exciting discussion and important dialogue that has gone on today. Just a few concluding points from my side. I think that maybe the questions that were posed throughout and at the beginning of the discussion that I maybe didn't speak as much to. And one is on how UN agencies can mobilize around this issue. And, you know, a big role that we have is to act, and also to call on member states to act, but to act quickly. And it's on the points that you raised, Ben, on both achieving the global recognition and implementing the right. And what does that action look like? It's in terms of reducing our environmental footprint, promoting low carbon approaches in our programs. In the case of child right defenders or human right defenders and child, we adults have a responsibility, our obligation to hear them, to act on their call to action, and to ensure that they're also supported and protected when they're making this call. Building capacity, I spoke a bit about that in the discussion about building capacity of children and young people, and including those from the most vulnerable and disadvantaged communities, and ensuring that appropriate safeguards are in place when doing so, and mobilizing, elevating their voices in the design of environmental policies globally. So that's very much on that question, I feel, which was one of the key questions. Moving forward, we all know there are millions of children and youth across the world calling for this urgent and ambitious action, and they have a right to speak up, and we have an obligation to take them seriously as they make this call, and not because we think it's a nice thing to do, but because it's our obligation. And that's all from my side. Over.
Thanks, Amy, particularly for highlighting that it's important the UN itself put its house in order, and there is an ongoing parallel discussion within the Environmental Management Group on the UN Sustainability Strategy. And it's really important that we think about the linkages between these various discussions and including human rights there. And again, for highlighting that this is a matter of obligation, moral, ethical, legal, so on and so forth. I'd like now to turn to you, Ambassador, for your closing remarks. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Ben, and I'm really happy to hear that there is so much support to what we all strive and try to do. As I said, it is an important issue. We will continue to work towards the consensus. I fully agree with David that it may be the case that we don't really garner support of 193 states, but we definitely need a really broad coalition to move forward, that this right is actually then credible and properly implemented. We really believe that there are many very positive aspects of this of proclamation of the right on a global level, because we do feel that we need to strengthen environmental laws, we need to strengthen the policies, we need to improve implementation, we need to improve enforcement, we need to do more on education, we need to facilitate public participation, and not just voicing what they want, but they need to know how to actually participate in environmental decision-making processing. We would like to see more accountability. We need to, push for better environmental performance. We need to do more on the social and economic rights. So all this, I think, needs a bit of time for the countries to grasp it, to digest it, to see how to move forward within their own national constraints, but also as in the regional context, and then of course on a global level. So I would really, issue an appeal to everybody to help us garner broad support, to help us persuade those who haven't yet been persuaded or who haven't yet been converted. And I really believe that altogether we will be able to respond to the public call, to the outcry of the youth, but also to the revenge of the nature via COVID, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And I hope I can speak for all of us in saying that we are looking forward to supporting that effort and looking forward to continuing discussions with you and your colleagues pushing for global recognition at the Council. David, I'd like to turn the floor over to you now for any final remarks.
Well, thanks, Ben. I will never pass up an opportunity for closing remarks. I would say one of the questions that's arisen and that constantly comes up are, what are the barriers to the recognition and implementation of the right to a healthy environment? And I really think this is where the UN agencies have an enormously important role to play. Things like weak rule of law, corruption, weak institutions, and a lack of capacity, financial and human capacity to recognize and implement the right to a healthy environment, is really at the heart of why it hasn't really been delivered yet or on the ground. And that's something the UN has the capacity, has the resources to assist states with. I also think it's essential to highlight how great the outcomes can be if states actually do recognize and implement this right. And we have examples from all over the world. The ambassador, Stadler Repnik, is very modest, and didn't talk about Slovenia's amazing accomplishments. I mean, Slovenia has over 40% of that country in national parks and protected areas, has a world-leading waste management system. Country like Costa Rica, which is a developing country, is one of the world's leaders in recognizing and implementing the right to a healthy environment. 25% of the country in national parks, has doubled the forest cover over the last 30 years, gets 98% of its electricity from renewable energy resources, uses a carbon tax to provide funding for indigenous people and rural residents to safeguard and restore the land and forests. And so, and Costa Ricans consistently rank as the world's happiest people, which really is a powerful illustration of how recognizing and implementing the right to a healthy environment is good for people at a basic level. And the final point I'll make is just that the Sustainable Development Goals are for 2030. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has said we need transformative change for 2030. We have 10 years left to really transform human society, or we're in deep, deep trouble where we will face really unprecedented levels of human suffering, human rights violations. So that's where the urgency comes from. If we do this together, we can produce just and sustainable outcomes where people live healthy, productive, and fulfilling lives in harmony with nature. And I'm just so honored to be working with all of you towards those fundamental goals for humankind and for the future of the earth. Thank you to everyone on this call for the work that you are doing.
Thank you, David, and many thanks to all of our panelists for their excellent contributions to this discussion. It's a discussion that we have to continue and we have to move forward urgently. We will have 2 more discussions in this series. We're still trying to identify the appropriate dates because, as you know, plans are constantly changing these days. But we're planning a discussion on human rights and climate change, and a discussion on human rights and biodiversity. If circumstances permit, we may try to meet in person, for example, at the discussions of the Convention on Biological Diversity. I think it's pretty optimistic at that point to think this could happen, but I'm trying to be optimistic. Regardless, I think we showed that this can work, particularly when we have such excellent panelists as a virtual format. And I'm really grateful to the UN Environmental Management Group for all of their support to make this happen virtually. And so I don't want to say much more than that. I've had more than my fair share of time. I'll just turn things directly over to Hussein, who's the head of the Environmental Management Group Secretariat, for his closing remarks. Thank you, Hussein.
Hussein, you're muted.
Sorry. So thank you so much, Ben, and the distinguished panelists and the participants. I think, Ben, you have concluded very well. The aim is for us is really to gather views from agencies, from other stakeholders on what could be the areas where we have to focus in the future in the human rights and environment nexus. As I said in my earlier intervention, what are the nexus areas where we have to cooperate around, and what are the opportunities for collaboration around those nexus areas? We would like to discover and explore those areas. We would like also to discover and explore conflict areas in those nexuses, and to see what are the solutions. And also we would like to identify areas where we have not, nexus areas that we have not actually discovered and identified in rights and environment. So if there is a definition, or if there is a sort of an approach that has to be developed, then we'll have to act together and to define approaches. I was very much gratified by the point that our colleague Sasha from CBD referred to. And it's very interesting that COVID, with all its challenges that has imposed to us, maybe it has created an opportunity and set the scene for making a case for the right for the nature now. I mean, we have really defended a lot throughout the years, of course, the right for human, but might be also a good opportunity for us also to advance the right of the nature as well. And we have two very important intergovernmental processes ahead of us on chemicals and biodiversity happening both next year. Let us develop some narrative that can embed the conclusion and outcome of these two very important processes, but also let us see how much these two processes can also advance human rights issues. So I'm sure there's a lot of resources, expertise from the system that can come to the help of member states to help all of the member states be able to advance on these areas. As I said, difference of level of development in many countries, especially in the South, has always been an excuse for not being able to advance on these areas and putting a lot of conditionality integrating into human rights. Let us focus on those areas and let us see how we can help them to advance. And with that, I would very much like to thank you, Ben. Office of the Human Rights has been instrumental in convening these dialogues and preparing the documents. Without you, Ben, and your team, we wouldn't be able to organize this. So thank you so much for also taking the responsibility and acting as moderator. We need agencies to come and to benefit from this platform and to play a role themselves. We're very happy to help them from the back and to support you from the backside and facilitate this process as always. Thank you very much to all of you, and I wish you a very good morning, afternoon, and a good weekend. All the best.
Thanks so much, Hussein, and just to thank to all of the people supporting this discussion and the background, Angela, Nina, Amanda, and many others. We reiterate that there will be recording, summary, and resources posted on the EMG website. And I don't know if there's any final technical announcements. If not, I think we can close. Okay. Well, thank you all. Really great to speak with you, and have a good weekend.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.